All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, or depending on your time zone, good morning to this ReNEWT webinar hosted by CMCC entitled Enabling Fairness for Energy Workers and Communities in Transition. So ReNEWT is an international consortium of researchers and policy analysts that was founded in 2018 and includes at least 25 partner organizations around the world. And the aim is for us to debate and evaluate implementable solutions to ensure a just and equitable transition for workforces in fossil fuel-based sectors. So today, we're very pleased to welcome Daniel Raimi and Wesley from Resources for the Future, who have been co-leading a project on policy developments to deal with workforces in transition, and have been doing this with first a US focus, which is what we'll be hearing about today, but also an international focus, trying to understand variation, how different countries' experiences have varied and what we can learn from that, with a team, including myself, working on the UK, a team in Poland and Germany, and another team working on the EU as a whole. But today we will hear about the findings from the US report. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would just like to clarify how we're going to handle questions. So we'll have clarifying questions. Any clarifying questions, you can raise your hands or put them in the Q&A, and I'll either interrupt the speaker, or we can, between the two speakers, you can pose it at that moment. But let's hold on any substantive debate questions for the Q&A session. And so I actively encourage you to write down your question in the Q&A chat, and to upvote questions you think are particularly important so that they rise to the top of the queue. Since our Q&A session is pretty short, we'll try to cover as many as we can, but we may not come to everyone's questions. All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce Daniel Raimi, who is fellow at Resources for the Future and a lecturer at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. He is the author of The Fracking Debates, published at Columbia University Press. And Daniel works on a range of energy policy issues with a particular focus on equitable energy transition. So with Wes, he has been co-leading the project Fairness for Workers and Communities in Transition. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marion. And thank you to the ReNEWT group for inviting us to be here with you today. It's a real pleasure. I'll be starting off the presentation, and then I'm going to try to hand it over to my colleague, Wesley, who's on the line. Wes has been having technical issues this morning. So we're going to cross our fingers and hope that it works for him. But I'll get us started today, and I'm going to share my screen. Our intention is to present for 20-25 minutes and then leave lots of time for question and answer and discussion. I think, as you'll see, the work that we've done raises as many questions as it does provide answers. So there's certainly a lot to talk about here. All right, so we call this work, the series of papers, Enabling Fairness for Energy Workers and Communities in Transition. As Marion said, the project has been led by Wes and myself. It's also been a collaborative effort between RFF and the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF. So I'll be referencing EDF occasionally in today's presentation. I also would like to start by acknowledging our collaborators who have helped in so many ways on this project. There are more people who have contributed to this project, including Marion, who are not on this list because we haven't published all the papers yet. But these are all the co-authors of papers in this series that have been published to date. They include Jake Higdon from EDF, our colleague Molly Robertson at RFF, as well as Dan Propp, who's now at Columbia University, Rebecca Glazer from the Georgia Institute of Technology, Gilbert Michaud from Ohio University, and Kelly Romer from Montana State University. So each of those folks have contributed substantially, as have many more that we aren't able to list here. Here's what we'll cover in today's presentation. I'm going to start off by providing an overview of major trends in the US energy sector, Because our work has focused primarily on the United States, we're going to mostly take a US lens on today's conversation. But of course, many of the principles and issues that we discuss for the United States are just as relevant, if not more relevant, for many other parts of the world, including the EU, as well as other nations. So we'd be eager in the conversation to broaden this discussion out beyond just the United States. But I want you to know that we are mostly going to focus on the United States in our presentation today. Second, Wes, if the technology allows us, will give you an overview of our research series and some of the key findings. He'll also note some of the future research activities that we have ongoing and that we hope to do in the months and years ahead. And then we'll look forward to questions and answers. So starting with major trends in the US energy sector, much of this will be familiar to many of you in the audience. The first thing that I want to start us off with is understanding that the mining industry, which primarily consists of energy extraction, coal, oil, and natural gas, plays a large role in many local economies in the United States, particularly in certain rural regions in the United States. This is a map that shows the percentage of county-level wages that come from activities related to coal, oil, and gas in the United States. The counties are shaded in terms of the percentage of total wages in that county that come, essentially you can think of this from coal, oil, and gas extraction. So you can see that some counties in the United States, including parts of Alaska, Oklahoma, Texas, Wyoming, 20% or more of all of the wages that are earned in those counties come from this particular sector. And I'll tell you that this is actually an undercount because it doesn't include other relevant sectors. This is just one way of kind of slicing the data. The point of showing this is to just kind of drive home the notion that fossil energy extraction plays a dominant role in a substantial number of rural US economies. If you total it up, it's something more than 100 counties in the United States rely on fossil energy for 5% or more of total wages earned in the county. So that matters a lot because the energy system is changing. Most of these changes in the United States have been driven by market forces to date. As you all know, there is quite limited federal climate policy to date in the US, although we do have some states that are taking more aggressive actions. The Biden administration is trying to advance federal climate policy, but it's a challenging road because of the political dynamics here in the US. Nonetheless, the energy system has changed dramatically in the last 15 years or so, and there are two major reasons for those changes. The first major reason for the change is the shale revolution. I wrote a whole book about fracking because I thought it was an important issue, and you can see the rise in natural gas consumption in the United States. Most of that is because fracking unlocked low-cost natural gas from shale formations across the United States, and that low-cost natural gas displaced coal primarily in the power sector. So most of the decline of coal in the United States has been due to low-cost natural gas driven by market forces. And in fact, I actually have sitting here on my desk a piece of the Marcellus Shale, which is one of the most important rock formations where a lot of this natural gas comes from. In addition to that important trend in natural gas extraction, fracking has also unlocked a lot of oil in the United States. So oil production in the US has increased dramatically, although consumption has been more flat. The other major trend in the US energy system that is changing the picture dramatically is the rise of renewables, wind and solar in particular. As you all know, costs for these technologies have declined dramatically in recent years, and that's led to their increased deployment, which has helped push coal out of the system even faster. These changes in the energy system have had substantial effects for the communities that I showed you in the map a little bit earlier. For coal workers, employment has declined consistently over the last several decades, and coal mining employment in the United States is now lower than it has been since probably the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. we're looking at less than 50,000 coal miners in the US, and that number continues to decline. The oil and gas extraction picture is a little bit more complicated. Because of the fracking boom, there was substantial growth in oil and gas employment over the last 15 years or so. But you can also see that those employment opportunities have been volatile, particularly in the support sector for oil and gas. These are the companies that provide services like cementing, hydraulic fracturing, and other well site services for the big companies like the Exxon Mobils or Chevrons or Shells of the world that hire those companies to perform work at the well site. So that green line are those service workers who have really experienced volatility as energy prices go up and down, and oil prices in particular is what is driving most of that volatility. But of course, as you all know, the need to address climate change means that we need substantially faster and deeper changes in the energy system in the next couple of decades. The graph here shows two scenarios from the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook from 2020. This is not a net zero scenario, but it's what they call their sustainable development scenario, which aims to achieve limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. That's the green line of the graph. The pink line is the IEA's stated policies scenario. So the pink line shows what the IEA expects will happen if existing policies remain in place and announced policies are implemented in the future. The green line shows you what we would need to do, roughly, to get on track to a 2-degree world. Regardless of the scenario you choose, you can see that coal demand in the United States is projected to decline. That's because of the factors I mentioned earlier, cheap natural gas, the rise of renewables, and improved energy efficiency. Oil demand in the United States is projected to remain roughly flat under the stated policy scenario, but decline dramatically in a sustainable development scenario. The same thing is true of natural gas. Now, if we look at nuclear and renewables, we see that there are clear opportunities for growth in that sector, with renewables growing the fastest in the next couple of decades under both scenarios. So that's just a little bit of background information. I'm now hoping to turn it over to Wes if he's able to join us. Wes, are you there?
I am.
Great.
So I actually will, Wes, it's so good to have you on the line. I was going to just ask one clarifying question to Daniel on behalf of Jiang Lin, who asks whether there's similarly fine-grained county-level data on tax revenue from coal, oil, gas industry.
That's an excellent question, and the answer is I am currently gathering that data. We have a research project that Wes is probably going to mention in a few minutes that I'm leading that is designed to understand public revenues from coal, oil, and gas across the United States. So the answer is it doesn't exist currently in a centralized database, but we're trying to put one together.
Great. So I'm delighted to introduce Wes Look, who is Senior Research Associate at RFF and former advisor on energy and environment to the US Senate Finance Committee. Wes is co-leading with Daniel the project Fairness for Workers and Communities in Transition. Wes, are you able to share slides, or should Daniel just keep his slides up and scroll through as you speak?
Yeah, the latter.
Okay, great. All right.
And apologies, everyone, that I'm having technical difficulties. Thank you so much for that introduction, Marion and Daniel, for those initial remarks. And again, echoing Daniel's gratitude for having us here to make this presentation today. And sorry that I'm not able to be there in digital visage. So next slide, please, Daniel. Great. So our report series covers, as Daniel has mentioned, covers a range of topics. And this includes, first of all, looking at looking at U.S. federal policies from a number of different lenses. And so we have a series of reports, one on economic development policies, one on environment and infrastructure policies, one on labor policies, including workforce training programs, and then one on sort of the broad social safety net policies in the United States. We also have done 3 case studies of very local examples of transition in the United States. So one is focused on a process of decommissioning coal plants in a tiny town in rural Montana, Colstrip, Montana. Daniel led on that one. The other is on sort of a complex series of deindustrialization processes in southeastern Ohio, the county of Athens, Ohio, which Daniel also led on. That involves coal plant closures, and Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but some coal mine closures, and maybe even a deeper history connected to the steel industry, and so a broad process of deindustrialization. And then a report that I led on with our colleague Dan Propp, looking at the decommissioning process of a coal-fired electricity plant in upstate New York, Tonawanda, New York. Marion also mentioned the partnership that we are involved with looking at European policies. This includes looking at EU-wide, the EU-wide policy framework that supports just transition policy. It includes looking at then individual national level policies in Germany, Poland, the UK, and actually also Spain as well, although that one's a little bit less far along at this point. Next slide, please. So actually, I didn't mention on the previous slide that in the United States, and actually drawing somewhat on the sort of preliminary results from the European work, we have developed what we call our Census Report, which is exactly that. It's synthesizing findings from these various other studies. And in that Census Report, we identify 5 kind of key findings. And we're going to go through those here. So the first finding, and I always feel a little bit self-conscious when I present these because they may seem obvious. We made an effort to really try to digest the work down to some core findings to help policymakers design just transition policy with a U.S. policy audience in mind. So the first key finding is that multiple and customizable policy types are needed. So we say, there's no silver bullet for a just transition. And instead, we find that policymakers will need to assemble a package that includes various types of policies. And we focus on the buckets of policies that we reviewed in our report series. So workforce development, economic development, infrastructure and environmental remediation, and public benefits, or these broad social safety net policies. So these policies in our analysis together intersect to form a network of support for workers and communities. I think as everyone on this call is very well aware, this transition presents a systemic shock to the communities where this occurs. And so a sort of a systemic or a set of policies that is able to touch a number of different pieces of the system are needed. So we also find that policies often excel, and this is supported by the literature, when they are tailored to unique local circumstances and also when they are targeted for populations most in need. We also find that in some cases, policymakers find success in designing policies that focus on a specific sector or sectors, such as trainings and financial support for coal workers or workforce training designed around, let's say, the labor needs of advanced manufacturing. Next slide, please, Daniel. So given this need for an intersecting variety of policies, we also find that policymakers will need to ensure that administration and implementation will be well coordinated. So we sort of, drawing on some literature, we use this almost like metaphor of horizontal and vertical coordination. And the horizontal coordination that we're talking about is an interagency coordination. Again, this is, all of this work is sort of focused primarily on the US federal policymaker audience. And so horizontal across federal agencies, right? And as many of you probably know, the United States government is quite a many-headed hydra. And so getting, that's probably a very negative connotation, but getting all of those important ministries or agencies to be working well together, so that the workforce training programs can be implemented in harmony with economic development programs, in harmony with the infrastructure and environmental remediation, and so on. We also talk about the importance of coordinating delivery at that vertical level. So this is across levels of government. In the US, it's federal, tribal, state, local, and that's what we sort of refer to as this verticality. And then also connecting with stakeholder groups. So really at that very grassroots level, and we talk later about the need for participatory process in this transition policymaking environment, and this vertical coordination is an important component of that. We also recommend that policymakers centralize and streamline service delivery. So sort of having like one-stop shops for access to programs. Another example of this, and there's conversation around this right now, is having a single government application that particularly in perhaps under-resourced, low-income communities that don't have a whole lot of familiarity with the vagaries of applying for federal funding, to streamline that application process so you could basically be accessing a number of federal programs at once. Next slide, please. We also, our third finding is that the strategic timing and sequencing of policy implementation is important. Again, this is perhaps a no-brainer. We identify sort of some near-term needs, including planning, and that's both sort of this broad scale planning like we see with the German Coal Commission, or we see in the state of Colorado in the United States, where you have these commissions that are stood up to map out the entirety, perhaps you could say, of the just transition process, but also much more localized economic development planning, even planning for specific projects. We talk in our report about a sort of policy support called pre-development, which is helping to do the planning and engineering studies that can make specific infrastructure projects or large capital intensive projects sort of quote unquote shovel ready. We also identify near-term needs of just making sure that there are jobs for people who may be losing jobs. So high quality jobs could include apprenticeships, income supports if jobs are not immediately available, or even if the jobs that are immediately available are offer a lower level of compensation than the incumbent job. We talked a little bit there previously about the supports for fiscal solvency, or the impact at least to fiscal solvency, and Danielle's doing great work on this. And then in the United States, there are bankruptcy laws that essentially allow coal companies and other large energy companies to be indemnified, and also to be free of their liability to pay into certain funds that themselves provide important supports through for, let's say, coal communities in particular. There's a program called the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund that is paid for by an excise tax on coal sales. There's also, that's actually maybe a little bit less of a factor. There's also commitments that the coal companies have to the retirement pensions of coal miners, and they're able to get out of those through bankruptcy. So reforming bankruptcy laws may allow for the federal government to not need to carry as much of the weight. We then also identify more medium and long-term interventions. We put sort of workforce training in that medium term, because it can take some time to retrain for a new a new sector. Infrastructure, environmental remediation, economic diversification, these are all things that might take a little bit longer. And then we do talk about how infrastructure and remediation may be sort of a win-win, and that they could provide jobs in the near term while also laying the groundwork for sort of that long-term future prosperity. Next slide, Daniel, thank you so much. So as the term just transition suggests, and I think maybe more so in the United States than in other parts of the world, that is a very fraught term for various reasons. But you know, we talk about in the beginning of our report the reason why we adhere to that term in our research. It is still sort of the dominant term to refer to this work. But as the term suggests, equitable and inclusive policy making and implementation will be critical. This is our fourth finding. So this includes addressing a legacy of underinvestment and environmental injustice in low-income and minority communities, ensuring procedural justice or procedural equity by engaging affected workers and communities in the design, implementation, and evaluation of policies. And then ensuring that programs are accessible and transparent in how funds are allocated and how program effectiveness is measured and evaluated, and et cetera. And going back to that point about bankruptcy, making sure that companies that have benefited from these activities of energy production bear appropriate responsibility in environmental remediation and other aspects of the transition, including some of the more social policy sides of things like the pension that I mentioned. Next slide, Daniel. So our fifth finding, again, ties back to this really important point about fiscal solvency. And it's that challenges that the energy transition poses for public revenue streams must be addressed. So we identify, we've got this chart here where we are identifying the various revenue streams to various levels of government, federal, state, and local, and tribal. So this includes production or severance taxes, production on public lands, property taxes, program-specific product fees like that excise tax that funds the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund that I just mentioned. And by the way, we could talk more about that, but it's essentially a fund to provide healthcare benefits to coal miners who have silicosis and other health effects, what is generally referred to as black lung. Petroleum product taxes, and a number of these really sort of standard baseline taxes that are also affected by decarbonization, income taxes and sales taxes. So we talk about how, although new economic drivers, including the investment in clean energy, but not limited to that, could replace some of these fiscal losses that these governments may face, federal leaders may need to design policy to bolster particularly subnational fiscal solvency. And so this includes a variety of measures we talk about. One is perhaps just raising new government revenue dedicated to this purpose. We talk about how this could be, perhaps ironically, partially established or achieved through a carbon tax. But that part of any carbon tax revenue that, of course, is helping to facilitate the transition on the kind of clean energy side and decarbonization side, but then making sure that some of the revenues in that process go back into supporting fiscal solvency. Another is just increasing spending from general funds broadly. I mean, we've seen some examples of this actually at the state level. The case study I mentioned in New York has an interesting component of this, where the state provided general funds to local governments to shore up the school district and other local services. And Daniel could talk more about this, but enhancing local fiscal autonomy is more of a regulatory tweak. Some states don't allow for local governments to have as much flexibility as they perhaps might ideally be able to have in terms of raising tax revenues and balancing their budgets as they see fit. So next slide. I'm going to move myself along here a little bit. We're nearing the end. So this slide just is pointing to the fact that our findings are aligning, I would say, as a number of research products are coming out in the United States, and also, research products and government documents, such as the White House executive order, recent executive order from the Biden administration, well, not that recent anymore, a few months ago, that's aimed at addressing communities in energy transition. We're seeing legislative proposals coming out of the US Congress. This House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis has this majority staff report. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with that committee, but it was stood up in the previous Congress to look at, to sort of come up with a comprehensive climate policy. The National Academies of the Sciences produced a report recently that also is looking at transition and has had some similar findings. And then I mentioned the state of Colorado has had this really, I would say, exemplary process where they stood up a commission that studied transition in the state of Colorado and came up with their kind of action plan, a lot of similar findings. Next slide, please, Daniel. So we also in our synthesis report identify a couple areas, and I think that we are all on this call very familiar of the no shortage of research needs in this area. This is a really exciting and challenging domain for research. We identify a few that we find particularly salient to the work we've been doing in the United States. So one is assessing the scale of the challenge. We've identified a number of the policies that are needed, but we don't yet have a strong sense, and we find that there, the research community broadly does not have, at least in the United States, have a strong sense of, well, okay, what level of spending, let's say, is needed from the federal government in the United States to invest in workforce training? What is really needed? What is the scale of intervention that is going to address the need and the problem? And that same question applies to, environmental remediation. How many coal mines are there, and what is the level of investment on average, or even at each specific site? Daniel's done some excellent work on identifying the level of need for remediating orphaned oil and gas wells, plugging orphaned oil and gas wells. And then there's the much more complex question of what is the appropriate level of investment in economic development and diversification. So assessing the scale of the challenge. Identifying metrics to enable adaptive management. There's some recent research, I think, coming out of this community that has been identifying indicators for evaluating the effectiveness of these programs. I find that to be very exciting work, and I think more of that is needed. And ideally identified early on so that programs can be somewhat structured around those indicators. We also find that it could be useful to do some more work identifying which opportunities could maximize future prosperity. Specifically, are there specific industries that could be mapped to specific regions that perhaps provide skill linkage, let's say, so we can maximize the sort of human capital transfer for workers from incumbent energy, fossil energy industries to new industries, perhaps clean energy industries. And then also continuing to just look for lessons from the past, both successes and failures. We've had some interesting conversations with policymakers in the U.S. where they're really asking for where has economic development transitions like this worked well, and we are still looking at examples, and I think more are needed. So I think that brings us to the end. Thank you very much, folks. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties on my end. And Marion, I suppose we pass it back to you here.
Yes, thank you, Wes. Yes, so it's now time for Q&A. So I ask all the attendees to type in their questions in the Q&A box. I am going to start off with some questions while people formulate, the audience formulates their questions, as right now we don't have any outstanding questions in the Q&A, and I have lots. So so you've described a lot of the sort of, you formulated your policy findings as kind of around needs, and I'm wondering how much is already in place, because there are economic development policies, training policies, and so on. and can be just sort of applied to this problem, versus how much kind of needs to be crafted from the bottom up, and kind of along the same lines, how much variability, if a lot of these reside at the local or the state level and instead of the federal level, how much variability across the US do you find in the sort of the capacity to put together all this policy framework?
I'm happy to start.
Do you want to start? Yeah.
And then eager to hear Wes's additions. I think at the federal level, there are programs that are, fairly well equipped to provide many of the interventions that I think are needed to support communities, but they don't have the scale that they currently need, and they don't have the targeting that they would need to focus on the communities that are most in need. The way that these programs were structured 10, 20, or 30 years ago, they didn't envision these sort of geographically concentrated shocks to local economies. They just weren't designed to do that. And so that is where you have the need to take existing federal government programs and resources and bring them together in some kind of centralized way so that you can pull from existing federal workforce programs, existing federal economic development programs, existing federal environmental remediation programs, and have a coordinated effort to provide the programs that are most needed in the place or in the relevant places. And the mix of needs is going to vary from place to place. Some places are not going to need much environmental remediation. Some will need a lot. Some places don't need a lot of new, let's say, transportation or water infrastructure, but some of them really do. Some of them, as Wes said, the skills of the workforce might be a good match to some emerging industry that might grow up in that place. But in other parts of the United States, those skill matches are probably not going to be there. And so there's going to be so much variation that I think there's a real need for the federal government, as Wes said, to coordinate, horizontally within different federal agencies, but then also vertically with the local governments, local unions, local businesses, and local non-governmental organizations who actually understand their communities the best, right? The people who live in these places, they know what they need better than anyone in Washington will. And so I think the coordination challenge is one of the biggest ones in doing this successfully. And then once you can sort of put together that coordinated effort, then the question is, what is the appropriate scale? And I think Wes highlighted, the need to get a better handle on that. When we actually look across the entire country and add up all of the programs that we need in all the places, what's the numbers? What are the numbers that we're talking about here? And I don't think we have a great handle on that yet.
Yeah, that's great, Daniel. And I would just add briefly that in the United States, we have a little bit of experience with this, at least, specifically this coordination of federal programs, some of which are doing a really good job of also coordinating with state and local governments around transition. And this is particularly through an initiative established in 2015 by the Obama administration called the Power Initiative. And the Power Initiative, is specifically designed to assist communities in coal country going through economic decline. And what it does is it harnesses the existing, or what it did, is that it harnessed the existing capacities of about 12 different agencies and identified one agency to be the head coordinating agency. That's the Economic Development Administration located within the Department of Commerce. And I think in many ways, I'm actually leading some research evaluating the effectiveness of the Power Initiative, but in many ways, what we will see, I think, going forward is like a Power 2.0. And so we have some experience working in this domain, but there's a lot more ground to cover.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But sort of, I think in Europe, we will have the sort of lessons emerging from the comparative study as well. But some of the most successful examples were in cases where local governments and local communities had very active processes for organizing local economic developments. So in Germany, where there's a lot of decentralization and this, and deciding on industrial investments, education, investment in universities, and so on. So, I mean, it seems like the US might be in a good place to also have a great deal of local level governance feeding into this process. Would you say that's the case, or do you think it's going to be very centralized, centrally driven?
Yeah, no, I think that is very much the case. And one of the, and Daniel, maybe you could speak a little bit to the Athens case study with respect to this question, but one of the key components of the Power Initiative is a agency that's sort of a federal state partnership called the Appalachian Regional Commission. And it's really similar, Marion, to some of those regional efforts in Germany. And the ARC is this, basically it's structured where there's a federal co-chair, there's then a rotating state co-chair of the 13 states in the region, and then there are, I think, over 50 what are called local development districts, and these are all sort of formal apparatuses of the structure of the organization. And it provides grants and capacity building, and it was actually established by President Kennedy, so it has a long, long history. They do research and evaluation, and they are very grounded in that region. In the conversations around establishing sort of a Power 2.0 or this next wave of just transition policy in the United States, I think folks are often coming back to the ARC as a model that we kind of need to create these sorts of commissions in various energy regions across the country or something like it. So yes, very much, I think in the United States, there is this focus on localizing and to not overlook, though, the role of the federal government in that process. And I think that is one of these really interesting challenges is you need the scale of investment that's going to come from the federal government, and maybe in in Europe, like there needs to be an EU role providing large pots of money, but then there needs to be flexibility at that more regional and local level with respect to how those resources are allocated. So this is challenge of tailoring and targeting to the local level, but also having this central governmental body that is helping provide the support.
Can I, Marion, just add on to that very, very briefly? I know there's another question you want to get to.
Yeah, we have now questions from our audience. So it's
great. Well, I can't resist to throw in one issue that's. I'm curious how particular this is to the United States and how much you might see this in some parts of Europe. So in the United States, there are many energy communities that have no interest in planning for a transition. They don't want a transition. They want to keep drilling for oil, refining oil, producing natural gas, consuming coal. And so one of the really big challenges here, especially when we're talking about being proactive and planning for 10, 20 years in the future, what types of efforts are needed to bring local stakeholders to the table who might not even buy into the idea of transition in the first place? That's one of the thorniest questions here in the United States, and one that we're really just starting to wrestle with, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we have a question from Elena Verdovini from CMCC, who says, who's asking about the comparative nature of the research. To what extent do you think the lessons learned in the EU and EU countries and the policy approaches implemented there can be relevant for the US and vice versa? Further, is there a scope to expect that the US and the EU will try to address the issues related to the just transition in a coordinated way? Are you aware of whether they are having conversations on this level, policymaker to policymaker?
Daniel, do you want me to take an initial crack at that?
Yeah, go for it, Wes.
Appreciate the question, Elena. That's great. Yeah, I think that the sort of premise for a lot of our work, right, going forward, Elena, Marion, perhaps others on this call, is that there is a lot to learn from one another in Europe and the United States. That certainly there are some important differences. You know, the European social safety net in many of the European countries and in the UK is by and large quite a bit stronger than in the United States. And so there's some important baseline differences that can affect the policy needs and interventions. But I think that nonetheless, that the trends of sort of isolated in many cases rural, in many cases sort of, I don't want to say, and this gets complex, but I don't want to say like caught in a sort of resource curse, but in many cases at least not widely diversified economies in these energy producing communities. Those issues are, it seems to me, similar across many of the European energy producing communities and the American energy producing communities. And so the challenges are very similar. And I think that, you know, we're talking about similar policy interventions. And so, yes, I think there is a lot to learn. Let me just say that. And beyond, I would say too, just Europe and the United States, but I'm aware of the process in South Africa and Australia and other parts of the world. And I think that, you know, I think there's lessons to be learned across the board, and that therefore continuing to have robust dialogue and, you know, facilitated by ReNEWT and other forums is excellent and very much necessary and beneficial. In terms of specific dialogues between European nations and policymakers and the U.S., I'm not aware of that. Most of the conversations that I'm aware of are really on the policymaking front, are really internal at the U.S. I know there are other places of like cross-pollination, like the Blue-Green Alliance, which is very connected to the policymaking process. It's a coalition of environmental and labor organizations in the U.S. that they did like a field tour with visiting policymakers in Germany, and so I know there's sort of outside of government communication going on, and there, for all I know, there is, but I'm just not aware of it.
And just briefly add to that, it's a fascinating idea, that the notion that there could be some coordination between the EU and the US. I think the thought of it makes my head spin a little bit, but I would love to think about that more and see if there was actually, you know, some way to do that in a coordinated way. The other thing that popped into my head, and I just ran back to my bookshelf to get this this book, which is called After Coal, Stories of Survival in Appalachia and Wales. And it's comparative history of coal mining regions in Wales and Appalachia. And my mother was Welsh, so I've actually spent a lot of time in Wales. And so I find this book to be really fascinating and provide some insight into some comparisons. It doesn't prescribe a way forward, but it does help with some historical grounding and similarities.
Great. We have two questions about specific local experiences you might be able to discuss in more concrete details. So one of them is about successful examples of job retraining and whether they are more related to job shifting rather than upskilling. And the other question is about the examples in which the voices of workers are included in you know, local structural change processes from the beginning, and whether that seems to speed up the transition. I think the question was worded very much in the context of current energy transitions, but given that's still very much sort of nascent, you know, maybe experience also in coal mining communities affected by the shale boom, or even previous deindustrialization processes might be interesting as well.
Yeah, I think I'll let Wes take the question about workforce skills, because he's led our work on labor issues. So I don't think there are many examples in the United States where workers directly have a major seat at the table in terms of crafting the transition strategies. I think it is the case that unions often do have a seat at that table. Of course, in the United States, unionization rate is quite low, particularly in the mining sector. In coal mining, unionization rates are relatively high. In power plants, the unionization rate is relatively high, but in some other parts of the fossil energy industry, it's quite low. And so that's all to say that I think unions often have, some seat at the table, but with most of the transitions that have taken place to date in the United States, which again is mostly a coal transition story, workers are certainly not taking a major role in planning for the transition. It's really kind of larger economic forces that have been shaping the changes that we've seen in those communities.
And I think that that's true in many ways, and that there are some efforts to try to bring in more grassroots voices, and in some cases, it may be workers. I think in many cases it's more like folks who are working with workers in nonprofits, sort of local level nonprofits. I'm thinking of an effort in Appalachia that were sort of have been a series of listening sessions, working with community scale, public health workers, just various people who are involved in the transition, but very much at that local level. And so one of those processes is something called the National Economic Transition Platform Development Process. I guess we frame it as the process. And this is something that it's a planning and conversation process that was led by a foundation in the United States called the Just Transition Fund. They support a lot of, actually strictly, I was going to say predominantly, but strictly coal community transition work. And they led this multi-year long effort of doing these listening sessions in communities across coal country in Eastern coal, so that's the Appalachian coal basins, but also in some of the Western coal basins, to really come up with a policy proposal that like our report, cuts across a number of these different areas: workforce training, economic development, environmental remediation. It's really broad. And so that's now been sort of like injected into the bloodstream of the DC policymaking community. And there have been efforts. There's a group called Reimagine Appalachia, or it's a coalition. And it's a coalition of a lot of these same groups that had been mobilized and engaged, and in some cases directly funded so as to bolster the capacity of the Just Transition Fund. So you can see this kind of building of that capacity. So there's some encouraging examples there. And that Reimagine Appalachia Coalition and another one called the Reclaim Coalition, they really are getting pretty active in the federal policy conversations. On the workforce training, I would say that, that's a good question. And I feel like I should know the literature a little bit better than I do in terms of what has been, where the successes have been. Is it with respect to, is it upskilling or just transitioning to a sector with similar skill sets? And I just a couple comments without feeling like this is a comprehensive answer. One is that we've done a little bit of work with my colleague Molly Robertson, or our colleague Molly Robertson. We've done some work looking at just simply where workers who leave a job in the mining industry go to next. And actually the majority finds a new job in the mining industry, but the second highest destination for coal workers, this is actually just looking at West Virginia, workers in the state of West Virginia, the second highest percentage, which is I think a pretty high percentage, around maybe 40% or so, go into construction. And construction is a place where there's a fair amount of skill transfer, and also you still can earn a pretty good wage. And there's a fair amount of unionization, and so benefits are good. So that's showing that there's a good amount of the labor force that is not going through some kind of upskilling necessarily. And also, I would say we have found in the literature looking at U.S. Workforce training programs that there's been a great deal of success with apprenticeship programs. And what I like about apprenticeship programs is that they provide both some skill transfer and an opportunity for upskilling. So you kind of get a win-win, and you get a job right away while you are upskilling. So you're not sort of stepping out of the labor market to do some training, but you're training while working. So there's a lot of interest in apprenticeship programs in the United States, and there is a federal apprenticeship program run through the Employment and Training Administration, and the Biden administration is trying to put more money into that.
Great, thanks, Wes. That's actually a good segue to the last question typed in the Q&A, which is about impacts. Oh, another one has come on board. Well, I'll look at that. But if we have a little bit of time left, how these, the EU ETS is, there's going to be a discussion. There's discussion about broadening to sectors that are not yet included. So likewise, in the US context, if we think of low decarbonization in sectors such as building and transport, do you see similar challenges around concentrated impacts? I mean, most likely also in transport. And how close do you see the challenges and therefore the policy recommendations in that context?
Are you thinking, Marion, about sort of manufacturing supply chains for internal combustion engines, or are you more thinking about the sort of energy burden, energy poverty challenges, or both?
Yeah, so since we're talking about workforce transition, would be like concentrated impacts on labor markets from shifts, and maybe in construction is more diffuse, and there's a challenge around upskilling of the workforce in construction, and transport, there are issues around switching technology and how that affects the supply chain. And yeah,
great question. So I think I first just want to acknowledge the importance of issues around energy affordability, energy burden, energy poverty. We haven't talked about that much today, but it's a really important issue here in the United States and of course around the world. And so just want to acknowledge the importance of that, and it's worthy of its own many webinars to come. But when it comes to labor issues, I think we're looking at really, really disruptive technologies coming down the pipe in the automotive sector, both in the manufacturing and also drivers of vehicles. And this is something that is going to play out in many parts of the economy. Maybe it'll happen quicker in manufacturing for vehicles because if we move rapidly to battery electric battery powered vehicles, there are far fewer components, they're simpler to maintain, and so we're looking at substantial job losses just due to the new technology coming on board. That is something that is on the radar of policymakers in the United States, as well as some researchers. We've done some work with folks from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They have a project called the Roosevelt Project, which includes a deep focus on parts of the United States that are dependent on those vehicle manufacturing supply chains. So we haven't looked closely at that, but it is an active area of research. And then just like big picture, I mean, the world of artificial intelligence and smart technologies, whether it's driverless trucks or whatever, I mean, this is going to be a huge issue across society in the next 10 or 20 years. I think maybe energy is out ahead of it a little bit, and maybe it's going to happen faster because of our need to address climate change. But I think this issue around technology and labor and how to develop a flexible workforce and policies that can support people when they are displaced from their jobs, which they will be by the technologies. This is like a really big societal question that I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of.
Yeah, and I would echo so in addition to the Roosevelt Project at MIT, there's a project called the Work of the Future Project. Some may be familiar with. If not, I really recommend just Googling MIT Work of the Future, an incredible team of researchers that are really just looking at the disruptive effects of digitization and AI, as Daniel's mentioning. And I've spoken with some of those researchers, and they are not yet really thinking about this decarbonization factor as well, or just trend of dislocation for workers. And so I do think, and Elena I hope that your ears are perked up here, because this is something that we, of course, have talked a bit about. I know you have some research, perhaps even started on, but I think that this, as Daniel was saying, beginning to think about these kind of compounding forces of transformation in the labor market could be really interesting, both in terms of the challenges and the opportunities, and what that means for upskilling and training and so on.
Great. Yeah, I agree. The synergy and double impact of digitization and low carbon transition are really a great area of future work. Well, I'd like to thank you both and thank you for our audience for your questions and for your attention. Yeah, wishing you all a great rest of the day, and you know, looking forward to future webinars where we'll be looking at some of the other issues that were raised in the Q&A. Great. Oh, and
thanks so much for facilitating, Marion.
We had a few pointers in the Q&A to additional resources. So I think I'll just say them now. So if people don't have, you can take a quick look. There's Helen de Koning is indicating that there is interesting work done by the members of climate strategies in different countries that outside of US and the EU. And the web link is climatestrategies.org, just transition. And Elena is pointing to 2d4d.eu. I don't know what it is, but probably very relevant. So 2d4d.eu. And finally, there's the link to the final report, was also given by Daniel. So it's RFF, Fairness for Workers and Communities. If you Google RFF, Fairness for Workers and Communities, you should find it. All right. Thank you very much. I think we're going to close the webinar now.
Thank you so much.